They are the most powerful superhero team on Earth, and every single one of them is a product, engineered from birth, owned by a corporation, and sold to a public that has no idea what's actually standing behind that logo. Every member who ever wore that symbol carries a story. Vought International will never put in a press release. Let's break this down. Homelander. Born in a Vought laboratory in 1980, not raised on a Kansas farm, not shaped by a loving family, not given a single moment of genuine human connection until it was far too late. The farm story was a marketing decision. The reality was sterile rooms, observation glass, and scientists who measured his heat vision output before they ever taught him what warmth actually meant. That origin isn't just tragic backstory. It's the entire explanation for everything that follows. His power set is almost unfair to list. Near total invulnerability. Supersonic flight exceeding Mach 1. Laser vision capable of reducing a human being to vapor in under a second. Super hearing precise enough to monitor conversations through reinforced walls. There's no conventional weapon on Earth that meaningfully threatens him. And Vought spent decades making absolutely certain he knew it. Nobody told him no. Nobody pushed back. Every institution that should have created accountability instead created a mirror, and what stared back got progressively uglier. The Stormfront relationship didn't create his ideology, it validated and accelerated it. She handed him a framework for the resentment he'd already been building for 30 years, and he accepted it enthusiastically. Then came Ryan. And here's the thing about Ryan. Homelander didn't become less dangerous when he discovered his son. He became more dangerous. Because now the sociopathy had a justification. Now the violence had a purpose he could point to. A man who believes he's protecting something real is significantly harder to reason with than a man who's simply cruel. Queen Maeve. She came in as a true believer. That part matters because it would be easier to dismiss her if she'd always been cynical. She wasn't. Recruited young, genuinely convinced that the Seven meant something, Maeve spent the early years of her career operating under the assumption that the mission was real and the marketing was just packaging. Vought was very good at sustaining that illusion for exactly as long as it was useful. The plane crash over the Atlantic happened in 2012. Flight 37. 40 passengers. Homelander refused to save because the optics of a failed rescue outweighed 40 human lives in his calculation. Maeve watched it happen, said nothing publicly, and then spent the next 8 years drinking that secret into something manageable. 3 seasons of the show are essentially the story of what that silence costs a person. The alcohol wasn't a character flaw, it was a pressure valve on a conscience Vought needed her to keep suppressed. What makes her arc genuinely earned rather than just redemptive is the specificity of the compromise. She didn't make one big mistake. She made 100 small ones, each individually survivable, collectively catastrophic. Her final act, physically throwing Soldier Boy away from the explosion at the cost of her own powers and nearly her life, was the first decision she'd made in a decade that Vought couldn't monetize. The members who follow her had no such clarity going in. Black Noir. The genius of Vought's marketing machine is that it turned a broken man into a brand. For 2 full seasons, the silence, the mask, the total absence of personality, that wasn't mystique. That was brain damage. Before he was the Seven's resident nightmare, he was a founding member of Payback Soldier Boy's team, operating in the 1980s under a Vought that was still figuring out how far it could push its assets before they pushed back. And Noir made a calculation. When the CIA came looking for leverage over Soldier Boy, he handed his own teammate over to the Soviets. Didn't hesitate. The problem was Soldier Boy found out. What followed wasn't a fight, it was a punishment. Soldier Boy beat him so severely that the neurological damage was permanent. No speech, no coherent emotional processing, just fragmented trauma that his mind reconstructed as animated cartoon characters visible only to him. Those hallucinations weren't a quirky character detail. They were the only way his fractured brain could process reality. The gap between his terrifying exterior, the Seven's most feared enforcer, the one who made Homelander nervous, and his actual interior, a man essentially trapped in a permanent dissociative state, is one of the most quietly devastating reveals the show ever delivered. And then it lasted about 90 seconds. Homelander killed him the moment he learned Noir had concealed Soldier Boy's survival. One arm through the chest, end of story, end of character. A founding member with decades of history, dispatched as a plot convenience. The show never fully reckoned with what it built. But what it built, while it lasted, was genuinely tragic, and that almost makes it worse. If the Seven's silent ghost deserved better, wait until you hear about the member who got exactly what Vought decided he deserved, which was almost nothing. The Deep. He assaulted Starlight during her first hour as a member of the Seven. That's not a subplot or a complication. That's the foundational fact of his entire arc. And the show never lets you forget it, even when he tries to. Vought's response was precisely engineered. Exile to Sandusky, Ohio, not prosecution. A PR cooling off period disguised as accountability, calculated to cost the company nothing while appearing to cost him everything. He lost his spot on the team. He did not lose his freedom, his powers, or Vought's long-term interest in rehabilitating him when convenient. What followed was a masterclass in satirizing male fragility so specific it becomes almost anthropological. He spent an entire season genuinely unable to distinguish between being held responsible and being persecuted. The Church of the Collective identified that confusion immediately and exploited it completely, assigning him a wife, Cassandra, managing his public rehabilitation like a product relaunch, and extracting loyalty by offering the one thing he couldn't manufacture himself, the feeling of being understood. His actual power, aquatic telepathy, the ability to communicate with sea life, became the show's most sustained running joke precisely because he formed real emotional bonds with every creature. Vought then forced him to eat or sacrifice. He wept over an octopus he genuinely loved. He swallowed a conscious lobster on camera. The horror and the comedy are inseparable, and that's the point. A-Train. He didn't trip, he didn't misjudge the distance. He ran through Robin Ward at somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 feet per second and kept going, because stopping meant answering questions, and answering questions meant a drug test. And a drug test meant the end of everything he had spent his entire life becoming. That choice, made in roughly the same fraction of a second it took to destroy her, defines everything about who A-Train is and what the Seven actually represents. The Compound V addiction wasn't casual. His cardiovascular system was deteriorating under speeds the human body was never engineered to sustain. Vought's medical team knew. His handlers knew. Nobody intervened because his merchandising revenue was north of $300 million annually, and his jersey was the top-selling item in the superhero apparel market for 3 consecutive years. The addiction wasn't a personal failing, it was a structural requirement Vought quietly subsidized until his heart gave out, at which point they were fully prepared to replace him. What makes his arc across all 5 seasons genuinely remarkable is the specificity of what he was performing. Not just heroism, respectable, palatable, non-threatening heroism within a corporate structure that had exactly 0 black executives in its senior leadership. He smiled at the cameras. He stayed quiet during Stormfront's tenure. He made the deal over and over again until the morning he handed Blue Hawk's location to Hughie and accepted, clearly and without drama, exactly what that decision was going to cost him. He lost his clearance level. He kept himself. Translucent. The power sounds simple until you understand the actual mechanism. His skin didn't just turn see-through, it converted into a carbon metamaterial capable of bending light around his entire body, rendering him visually undetectable at every wavelength the human eye can process. Thermal imaging couldn't find him. Standard surveillance couldn't catch him. He was, for all practical purposes, a ghost that could shake your hand. Vought didn't deploy him as a frontline fighter. They deployed him as an intelligence asset. His primary operational function was surveillance of targets, of civilians, of celebrities, and critically, of other members of the Seven. He was the organization's internal monitoring system walking around in a human body, and the information he gathered gave Vought leverage over virtually everyone in their orbit. He wasn't the most powerful member of the team, he was arguably the most dangerous one to have as an enemy. His death ran 47 minutes into the entire series, and the show used it to issue a warning it never walked back. Hughie Campbell, terrified, untrained, morally overwhelmed Hughie Campbell, detonated a shaped charge that had been inserted inside Translucent's body because that was the only surface his powers couldn't protect. The explosion wasn't clean, the decision wasn't clean. That was precisely the point. The boys established in one visceral sequence that victories in this world come with a price you pay with a piece of yourself. And the next member of the Seven made that price even steeper. Lamplighter. Before Starlight ever stepped into the Seven's glass tower, this slot belonged to a pyrokinetic who spent years doing things far uglier than publicity shoots and press junkets. He was Vought's inside man, their spy embedded within Grace Mallory's operation, feeding intelligence back while the boys thought they had a trusted asset. The arrangement worked until the night it catastrophically didn't. Lamplighter went to send a message to Mallory. He burned the wrong targets. Her grandchildren died in that fire, and the guilt of that single irreversible mistake didn't just destroy one woman's family, it dismantled the entire operation. Mallory disbanded the boys. The network collapsed. 8 years of silence followed, and every domino that falls across the show's present-day timeline traces back to that one night. Here's what makes him genuinely tragic rather than simply pathetic. He knew exactly what he was. By season 2, he's not a superhero in any meaningful sense. He's a janitor with fire powers, babysitting Vought's illegal Compound V experiments at Sage Grove Center, lighting his cigarettes with the same hands that killed 3 children. The Seven discarded him completely. No statue, no farewell, no acknowledgement that he'd spent years destroying his own conscience on their behalf. His suicide in Vought's Hall of Heroes was the show's most precise indictment of the institution. He burned himself alive, surrounded by marble monuments to teammates who never looked back. Vought didn't mourn him. They barely noticed. And somehow that indifference lands harder than any punishment could. What comes next makes even Lamplighter's story look almost forgivable. Stormfront. Her real name was Clara Rissman. She received Compound V in 1919, married Frederick Vought himself, and spent the following century watching ideologies rise, collapse, and get repackaged, while her own never moved an inch. That's the detail the show refuses to let you process comfortably. Stormfront isn't a dark chapter in Vought's history that the company eventually overcame. She is the founder's wife. The Nazi origins aren't buried in the institution's past, they are the institution's genetic material. Her Season 2 arc as a social media phenomenon was terrifyingly credible precisely because she'd earned that expertise the hard way. She watched fascism build its first mass movements. She watched it fall. She studied which rhetoric worked on which demographics across 2 full cycles of radicalization, and by the time she arrived on Twitter and Reddit with a selfie and a catchphrase, she wasn't guessing, she was applying a century of field research. No other character on the show understood manipulation at that scale, because no other character had lived long enough to develop the pattern recognition. Ryan burning her face and Homelander abandoning her afterward left her alive, but obliterated. And that ending was deliberately more unsettling than death. Death would have been a conclusion. Instead, she simply continued, diminished and discarded, another person Vought finished using. The next members of the Seven understood that particular feeling better than most. Supersonic. 48 hours. That's the entire runtime of his membership in the Seven. Drummer Boy, civilian name Eli, stage name Supersonic, went through the full Vought audition process, survived the reality competition format they used to manufacture his casting as a public spectacle, and was dead before he could unpack whatever passed for a locker room at Vought Tower. His power set was genuine, sonic manipulation precise enough to shatter reinforced materials, disrupt nervous systems, and project concussive waves at variable frequencies. In a functional superhero organization, that's a valuable toolkit. But the Seven was never a functional superhero organization. What made Supersonic genuinely rare wasn't his abilities, it was his character. He was one of the show's only supes who seemed to have processed the moral weight of what Vought actually was. He approached Starlight not to leverage their history, but because he'd seen enough to know something had to change from the inside. He was decent, earnest, willing to take real risk, which is exactly why Homelander killed him. The murder happened off-screen, which was the point. No confrontation, no spectacle, no moment where Supersonic could be heroic in his final seconds. Homelander had the body dissolved before anyone filed a question. He then informed Starlight personally, calmly, making sure she understood the arithmetic. Anyone she trusted became a target. His death didn't confirm that the Seven was dangerous. It confirmed it was a hostage situation with a roster. He mattered because his pointlessness was the message. Starlight. She walked into Vought at 23 years old, carrying 23 years of genuine belief, and spent the next 3 seasons watching it get methodically stripped away. Annie January grew up in Iowa treating superheroes as proof that the world had a moral architecture. She had her own legitimate power, bioelectric energy absorption and projection capable of disabling electronics, blinding opponents, and releasing bursts strong enough to stop a train mid-stride. And she had something rarer, actual conviction about what that power was supposed to mean. The Seven processed her immediately. The Deep assaulted her in her first week. Vought replaced her practical costume with something engineered for a different audience entirely. A PR handler provided her approved talking points. Her actual abilities were deprioritized in marketing materials because her smile tested better in focus groups. The machinery was comprehensive and it was fast. Here's what makes her arc compelling rather than simply brutal. She didn't break. She leaked classified information to Hughie Campbell over multiple seasons, testified against Vought in a congressional hearing while still nominally employed by them, left the team twice, and returned each time with clear strategic purpose. She built external alliances, cultivated political capital, and ended the series as the most significant figure the soupy community had ever produced in American public life. Not because the system reformed around her, but because she refused to let the system define the terms. She is the show's most precise answer to what heroism actually requires. The next tier of members makes Starlight's resilience look even more extraordinary by contrast. Black Noir. 2. The costume came first. That's the thing you have to understand about Nadia's recruitment into the Seven. Homelander didn't go looking for a person with a specific skill set or a particular ideology. He went looking for someone who could wear the suit, someone who could fill the visual slot the original left empty without asking complicated questions or carrying complicated feelings about what they were replacing. The commentary the show is making here isn't subtle, and it isn't trying to be. Corporate diversity logic reduced to its most honest form. The uniform matters, the human inside it doesn't. Nadia's power set tracks the originals in broad strokes: enhanced combat ability, a preternatural comfort in darkness, a physical lethality that makes her genuinely dangerous in close quarters. She can move through shadow in a way that reads as near invisibility to anyone not specifically looking for her, and her hand-to-hand capability puts her well above baseline human soldiers. On paper, she's a worthy successor to the role. On paper. What she isn't, by deliberate design, is complicated. The original Black Noir carried years of suppressed trauma, a fractured identity, a relationship with Homelander that was the show's darkest secret for 3 full seasons. Nadia carries none of that weight, and Homelander specifically didn't want her to. A subordinate with psychological depth is a subordinate who might surprise you. What he wanted was a uniform that moved and fought and didn't push back. That shallowness isn't a writing failure, it's the indictment. Sister Sage. The most intelligent human being on Earth is not hyperbole. That was the literal clinical description of her power. An enhanced prefrontal cortex running probabilistic social modeling in real time, processing variables at a scale no unaugmented human brain could approach. She could look at a social system and calculate its failure points the way an engineer reads structural stress diagrams. She could map the downstream consequences of a single political decision across years of likely outcomes before most people finished reading the headline. She was, by every measurable standard, the most dangerous mind in any room she entered, and she chose Homelander. Deliberately. Not out of fear, not out of manipulation, but because she ran the numbers and decided that aligning with the fastest rising authoritarian power structure was the most efficient path to dismantling the existing one. It's a calculation that the show refuses to either fully endorse or fully condemn, which is what makes her genuinely interesting rather than just another villain with a philosophy speech. Here's where it gets darker. She performed lobotomies on herself. Routinely, voluntarily, a ice pick and a few minutes of self-administered surgery that temporarily blunted the prefrontal enhancement and let her feel, for a few hours, what it was like to be stupid, to not see everything coming, to experience the world without the constant weight of knowing. Her genius wasn't a gift she'd learned to leverage. It was a condition she couldn't escape except through self-harm, and that single detail reframes everything about her: the ambition, the ruthlessness, the alliance with Homelander, as survival behavior. Firecracker. She was a media personality before she was a weapon, and that sequencing matters enormously. By the time Homelander recruited her into the Seven, Firecracker already had what no other member of the team possessed: a pre-built audience of millions who trusted her more than they trusted any government institution, any legacy news outlet, or any superhero currently operating under Vought's official branding. Her followers didn't just watch her, they believed her, with the specific fervent loyalty that only comes from years of calculated parasocial intimacy. Homelander didn't recruit a soupy who happened to have a media platform. He recruited a media operation that happened to have superpowers. Her powers themselves are relatively modest by Seven standards: explosive projectiles generated from her body, a physical toughness above baseline human. She's not Homelander, she's not even close to Homelander, but information warfare, the show is arguing explicitly through her existence, is now equal in strategic value to physical power. You can stop a laser with the right technology. You can't stop a narrative once it's embedded in enough people's identity. What keeps her from being a cardboard ideological prop, and this is where the writing earns real credit, is that her grudge against Starlight is personal, years old, rooted in a specific humiliation from before either of them was famous, a social wound that festered across a decade while Starlight became a symbol and Firecracker became something harder and angrier. That personal history gives her grievances texture and specificity. She isn't just a political position with a face, she's someone who got hurt, chose a particular way to metabolize that hurt, and followed it to its logical end. The Tech Knight. The Batman analog was always the most overdetermined character archetype in superhero fiction, the billionaire with no actual powers who compensates through technology, obsessive preparation, and a psychological darkness the narrative frames as tragic depth rather than clinical pathology. The show looks at that archetype and asks what it would actually look like if you dropped the romanticism. The answer is Robert Vernon, wealthy, brilliant, technologically formidable, and afflicted with a compulsive disorder so specific and so consuming that it hijacks his entire behavioral framework. His darkness isn't brooding, it's diagnosable. His resources brought genuine strategic value to the Seven's rebuilt roster, proprietary technology, independent wealth outside of Vought's direct control, and an investigative capability that made him useful in scenarios where laser vision and superhuman strength were less relevant than finding information someone wanted buried. He was functionally the team's intelligence asset wrapped in a billionaire's insulation from consequence. The compulsion itself is played for uncomfortable comedy and then for something more unsettling. A reminder that the show has always been interested in how power interacts with pathology, how the systems that produce superheroes also produce the specific varieties of broken that wealth and ability enable. What the four new members of the Seven collectively represent, though, is a question the final chapter is going to have to answer. What the roster actually tells us. 14 members, one genuine Nazi, multiple victims of institutional assault, and a dozen people slowly destroyed by the gap between the hero they wanted to be and the product Vought needed them to play. The only person who came out ahead treated the whole thing as a war, and she was right.